Hey, eighth grade. Here's some Abraham Lincoln pickup lines for you. Abe Lincoln may have emancipated the slaves, but you've emancipated my heart. Slow clap for that one. Hey, babe, if you were president, you'd be called Babraham Lincoln. Woo. All right. Two's enough, I guess. Um, Feel free to use those as always, eighth grade. They're my gift to you. All right. We are on slide 15. So we're going to be talking about the emergence of the Republican Party and a Supreme Court decision called Dred Scott, and then the emergence of Abraham Lincoln onto the political scene in America. All right, so we know that by the 1850s, there's a lot of tension in the United States, primarily over the slavery issue. People identify themselves not so much by which political party they belong to, but more by where they come down on the issue of slavery. And people from the slave states are all pretty united on the issue in favor of slavery, whereas people from the northern states are a mixture of abolitionists and also people who just don't want to see slavery expand any farther from where it is now, right? Maybe they wouldn't describe themselves as anti-slavery quite, but they would say it's not good for the country that slavery exists. It's not good for the country that slavery is going to expand into these newly acquired territories, right? So rather than being divided among Democrats and Whigs, they're divided among North and South over the issue of slavery. Remember, neither Democrats nor Whigs are willing to take a strong stance on the slavery issue because both of these political parties understand that they have a lot of pro-slavery and anti-slavery supporters. Pro-slavery supporters and abolitionists and anti-slavery activists in both parties. So if you're in charge of the Whig Party or you're in charge of the Democrat Party, you've got all these people saying we need to take a stand on the slavery issue. Strategically, you're thinking that's a terrible idea because if we do that, then half of our people are going to leave, right? They're not going to be part of our party anymore. Well, the refusal of the Whig Party to take a stand on the slavery issue backfired pretty spectacularly because enough Whigs were strongly opposed to slavery and they decided to leave the Whig Party and form their own anti-slavery party called the Republican Party. So the Republican Party was made up of Whigs who opposed slavery, plus basically all of the Free Soil Party got absorbed into the Republican Party. And also a lot of anti-slavery Democrats joined the Republican Party, right? Because while they agreed with the Democrat Party on other issues like how to interpret the Constitution and states' rights and how powerful the federal government should be, they were really single issue voters at this point. They cared about slavery more than anything else. And so they said, fine, we're going to ditch the Democrat Party because they refused to take a stand on slavery. So I'd rather be part of a party that's explicitly anti-slavery, the Republican Party. Right? So the Republican Party absorbed membership from these three different sources. Now, the Republicans really exploded onto the scene. They won a lot of congressional seats in their first election. And they ran a major party candidate for president against the Democrat nominee, James Buchanan. Now, the Republicans lost this first presidential election. James Buchanan, a Democrat, became president. But this loss actually wasn't really all that bad for the Republicans because in losing to James Buchanan, the country saw really clearly, okay, the Republicans are the party that you want to belong to if you're anti-slavery. whereas the Democrats still don't have a position on slavery. They're still not willing to take a position. So even though the Democrats control a lot of Congress and control the presidency, their hold on it is probably going to be pretty limited, right? So if you don't like slavery, you want to be a Republican. By the way, the Republican Party that's established at this time is the same Republican Party that exists today, right? So remember the Republican Party from the early 1800s with Thomas Jefferson, that is a totally different party than the party that exists today. This Republican Party from the early 1850s is the same Republican Party that exists today, just like the Democrat Party established in the 1820s by the Jacksonians is the same Democrat Party that exists today. So now we have the two political parties that we have today. They're from the early and mid 1800s. All right. So now we need to talk about a Supreme Court case that's really, really important called Dred Scott v. Sanford. Right? And a lot of people point to this decision as one of the three worst Supreme Court decisions of all time. Right? A lot of people who don't like the power of the Supreme Court, they think it's too powerful. They'll point to Dred Scott as an example of the Supreme Court abusing its power. Right? So, in 1857, the Supreme Court issued its Dred Scott decision, which was the fifth major event that pushed America into the Civil War. Right? So, quick review, we can go back over the previous four. The Mexican-American War was a big event because it resulted in the Mexican Cession, and that caused a lot of problems. Number two, the Compromise of 1850 was a major event. Number three, the publishing of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Number four, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was a major event. And number five is the Dred Scott decision. So, what is the Dred Scott decision? So in Dred Scott v. Sanford, we have an issue in which there was a slave named Dred Scott who was owned by an army doctor. Right? So he was an army doctor's slave. Now, army doctors travel all around the country, right? Because you get moved. If you're part of the military, you get moved all the time. So this army doctor is being sent to different positions all across the country. So sometimes Dred Scott is with him in slave states. Sometimes Dred Scott is with him in free states or free territories, places where slavery is illegal. Right? So while Dred Scott is in a free territory, a bunch of anti-slavery lawyers talk to Dred Scott and they tell him, hey, we don't have slavery in this territory, and yet this doctor is continuing to own you as his slave. That's illegal. Let's sue. Let's sue for your freedom. Let's take your case to the government. So Dred Scott says, okay. Right? And basically, Dred Scott and his lawyers are arguing that because slavery is illegal in the free states and the free territories, if a slave is brought into one of these territories, he is now automatically free. All right? And basically, the court rejected Dred Scott's appeal. Right? Dred Scott was basically asking to be freed, and the Supreme Court said no. Now, it matters a lot that the Supreme Court said no, but the main reason that the Dred Scott decision is so significant is how the Supreme Court said no to Dred Scott. Right? So in the Dred Scott decision, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was a man named Justice Taney. Justice Taney said that Dred Scott is still a slave because even when a slave is in a free state or a free territory, he is still a slave. Right? So even if you live with a master in a place that doesn't allow slavery, you are still a slave there. Right? And Northerners are like, well, wait a second, what's the point of having free states if people are allowed to own slaves in free states? Justice Taney didn't really address that question in the case. He just ignored it. Right? He said, if you're a slave, doesn't matter if you're in a free state or a slave state, you're still a slave. Dred Scott was also controversial for several other reasons. Here's some other reasons. Number one, it said African Americans are not U.S. citizens. Right? So even if you're free, even if you're born and raised in a place like New York and you've never been a slave before, you pay taxes, you have a job, maybe you served in the military, you are still not a U.S. citizen. Right? So he said black people, African Americans are not U.S. citizens. Right? That shocked a lot of people, especially all these African Americans who up until this point thought they were citizens. And so he said, because you're not a citizen, you don't have the right to actually sue. So he said, we don't even have to decide whether or not you're free or a slave because you're a black guy and black guys don't have the right to sue for their freedom. Number two, he said slaves were property, not people. Right? The Supreme Court had never explicitly stated this before. The Supreme Court was now saying slaves are property, not people. Right? A lot of people up to this point thought that slaves were both people and property, or abolitionists, of course, thought that they were people who were being unfairly treated as property. But the Supreme Court said, nope, slaves are not people, they are property, kind of like cattle or horses. Another reason the Dred Scott decision was so controversial is because it said Congress does not have the power to prohibit slavery anywhere because of the Fifth Amendment. So he said the Fifth Amendment says the government can't take away property without due process of law. So therefore, Congress does not have the power to make slavery illegal anywhere. So therefore, the Missouri Compromise is gone. I guess the Compromise of 1850 would be gone as well, right? Because the Fifth Amendment says you can't take away property, slaves are property, therefore any laws that say slavery is illegal, gone, right? So slavery was now officially legal in all of the territories. Now, the northern states knew that slavery was never going to be legal there, although under the Dred Scott decision, it suggests that people maybe could own slaves in the North. But what really upset Northerners is that the Dred Scott decision basically made it seem like all future states would be slave states. So Southerners were really, really happy at this decision because it seemed to solve all their problems, right? If all of the new territories become states that have slaves, then slavery is going to probably be protected in the United States for a really, really long time, and they don't have to worry about losing slavery. Northerners get really, really mad, right? Because we have the court destroying an act of Congress by itself, right? So a lot of people thought this is a violation of checks and balances. The North is also really mad because the Supreme Court is basically saying, yeah, slavery is going to be here permanently in the United States. If you don't like it, too bad, you can go to a different country, right? So Northerners were really mad about that. So what happens because of the Dred Scott decision? Well, this further polarizes the country. It makes a lot of Northerners who were not really angry about slavery feel really angry about it. It also caused an Illinois lawyer named Abraham Lincoln to start speaking out against the decision. So Abraham Lincoln was not an abolitionist, but he did think that slavery, at the very least, should not spread to other states. And he did think that it was wrong that black people, African Americans, could not be citizens.